Section 6 of the Western Boundary and Other Essays by Helmuth von Moltke. Translated by Charles Flint McClumpher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Alistair. Holland and Belgium in their mutual relations from their separation under Philip II till their reunion under William I. Part 1. When a people of its own free will despises the blessings of peace and renounces its own rights, while at the same time rejecting its obligations, when severing the bonds of society it returns to the primeval state of force, in a word, when it launches itself upon a sea of revolution, whose course cannot be directed by any human intelligence, and for whose limitation mundane events must be united with the genius of the greatest men, then is it right for us to search for the causes which give rise to such extraordinary manifestations. Indeed, only the unavoidable necessity of preservation of being and of unalienable human rights, and not hope, be it ever so alluring, not dissatisfaction, be it ever so well based, not example, be it ever so near at hand, can move a people, one would suppose, to expose itself to the incalculable casualties of anarchy, of civil war, of foreign tyranny, and of ruin. For the revolutions which in their time of duration have made even the worst government a thing to be wished for, again have led quite as often to despotism as to freedom. We seek in vain for the cause, and the consequent result, only there where not conviction, but passion, not deep-felt necessity, but interests are to a certain extent the springs of action which set the mass in motion. The fields of Belgium, drenched with blood for centuries, offer us today the spectacle of a people that takes up arms against its ruler and against its countrymen. The flames which mount the ruins of Antwerp are now illuminating great catastrophes, and Europe looks for the decisions which are weighed in the councils of its courts. The more unexpectedly the scenes are presented before our eyes, the less we see them conditioned by necessity, and so much the sooner do we direct our view to the period which preceded, and seek amid the history of the world for the key to events which seem apparently to be unrelated to the causes. Space may be made here for a short sketch of the epochs which both neighbouring countries share in their internal interests, a retrospect of events which have forcibly separated the peoples in their religious and political life, in their customs and in their civil and commercial relations, and which have given birth to that mutual hatred, irreconcilable even after 16 years of peaceful government, and unmistakably participant in the present violent attacks. Without entering into an extended discussion of the events, it will be necessary to understand the principle underlying them, in order to explain the motives which gave so contrary a direction to the character of two peoples seemingly destined by their common origin, by their position in the world, and by their lot to form one people. The reign of Philip II of Spain was the epoch in which the southern and northern provinces of the Netherlands were first opposed to each other, when their interests began to be separated, and to be arrayed in decided opposition to each other. This monarch united under his sceptre various Netherland provinces which had not been joined since Caesar's time, and were not again until the time of Napoleon. He acquired the sovereignty of this rich country in its most flourishing period, but in the eyes of such a monarch as Philip, this wealth, this spirit of independence and arrogance produced by prosperity, and still more the liberty, under whose protection alone the former had sprung up in a mercantile state, were necessarily a limiting barrier to his despotism. The chief trait in the dark character portrait of King Philip of Spain was insatiable desire for power, possession of territory, of which the Spanish so proudly said that the sun would never set upon it, was not enough for him. He stretched out his hand towards Portugal, England, France, and Germany. But Philip's greed for power went further, not only over countries, but also over minds. Over opinions did he purpose to reign. Therefore Catholicism was to him the surest pledge of unlimited power, the Reformation its most threatening enemy. To an unyielding fatality he opposed a still more unyielding will, and even if we find the motive by which he acted detestable, we cannot refuse to admire the consistency with which he acted according to this idea, and that too during a life of 70 years, and a reign of 40. But a people thoughtful by nature and prosperous must have soon felt the need of a better understanding of religious affairs, and civil liberty gave rise to an early desire for freedom of conscience. So great was the desire for this, that already during the reign of Charles V, more than 40,000 men, heretics in the eyes of the authorities, martyrs in the eyes of a vastly greater host of secret sympathizers with the new doctrine, ended their lives upon the scaffold. Because of his greatness, men suffered this monarch to do that which was no longer pardoned in his successor. The nation forgot their love for liberty in their love for the military glory which reflected from their emperor, their countrymen, upon themselves, and furthermore his political ascendancy secured innumerable advantages to their business. With a smile did the emperor charm the people at Brussels, upon whose property he was laying his hands, and from the midst of whom he was choosing bloody sacrifices. Not so with Philip. The Dutchmen demanded from the absolute sovereign of the proud Castilians respect for their mercantile privileges, for the chaotic state of their local rights and liberties. They demanded freedom of thought, the very thing that the Catholic king could least grant them. Despite all persecutions, the light of the new faith had already spread so far that King Philip believed that he must meet an evil so fearful with a fearful remedy. This was the Spanish Inquisition, the most despicable invention of human tyranny, if not the most horrible and most bloody. But only by the aid of an army could such an institution be forced upon the people. That is to say, the Netherlands suffered one evil through another evil. Both were attacks upon their most sacred rights, and forced the power of the ruler to the very acme of despotism. The people rose in opposition. Philip had purposely annoyed and repulsed the Dutch nobility. This time it was the noble who kindled the flame of rebellion. The compromise, the Beggars' League, was first started by the nobleman. He protected the public sermons, and iconoclastic tumults themselves were his work. So we behold the ruler of Spain, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, Milan, of a part of the Netherlands, and of kingdoms in America more extensive even than Europe, in a contest with the peaceful inhabitants of a contemptible corner of the earth, scarcely 1,000 square miles in area. The son of Charles V employed the victorious armies of his father, the greatest generals of his time, the treasuries of both Indias, the heroic youth of Spain and Italy, and the good fortune of his peoples for the smothering of this insurrection. He lost them all, and more, for the assassination of the Prince of Orange rests upon his royal honour. Although nature fixed the limits of his days afar, yet he did not survive the issue of this struggle, which embittered his whole life for almost half a century, and his successor inherited, along with an unended war, a debt of 500 millions which had already been squandered upon it. But the point which we are to make especially prominent as a result of this great tragedy is the Union of Utrecht. 10 years' war devastated the Netherlands, which at one time had been so prosperous, without resulting in a decisive victory for either of the two parties, or essentially changing the condition of affairs. The history of all the transactions on both sides is like that of a city, which is besieged and opportunely relieved, or in case it falls is retaken, because the army of the enemy has not been slain. Indeed, the Prince of Orange made 2 campaigns against the Spanish army, with one army of hastily collected and undisciplined troops, which was harassing the country round about. He challenged to battle the most victorious general and the best soldiers of his time. There was only need of a victory on open field, and everything declared itself against Alva, the founder of the blood tribunal of the 12 and the 10th penny tax. The hostile castles and strongholds then voluntarily threw open their doors, and the war was decided with one blow perhaps. There was so much to win that the Prince of Orange could afford to lose one part of that rabble shrieking after pay, which a few days later, nevertheless, he had to give up, because there was lack of gold, and because the whole country was being devastated, while it had not rendered any services for its monstrous costs. But the Duke of Alva surveyed his position just as thoroughly, and by avoiding the battle he earned all the advantages of a most complete victory. The inhabitants defended their posts as vigorously as this army, which had been enlisted under the flags of the Netherlands, proved to be inactive on the open field of battle. Naerden's chastisement and the unparalleled cruelties which were perpetrated there under the eyes of Don Frederick of Toledo had left no hope to the dwellers in the cities, threatened with a like fate, and forced them to become heroes. Unprotected localities like Haarlem, Alkmaar, and Leyden withstand all efforts of the victorious enemy 7 months. Fleets are built for their defence, and the very sea created on which these should carry on operations. Such was the state of affairs under Alva, and such they continued to be until the death of Requesens. The death of this distinguished man happened so suddenly that he did not have time to appoint his successor in the office of chief stadtholder. Thereupon the Dutch Council of State took possession of the government, and it was actually approved by the king for a time. Of course, the most influential members of this State Council were for the Spanish, but these were removed by force from the Orange party. The states were convoked, and immediately a circumstance happened which had the most decisive influence. One phenomenon peculiar to this war was the military insurrections, which greatly crippled the undertakings of the Spanish generals, being at the same time more pernicious to the loyal provinces. They were the natural results of several simultaneous undertakings by Philip, who little by little became involved in quarrels with half Europe, and thus, notwithstanding all silver fleets, drained his treasury to such an extent that the troops waging war in the Netherlands received their pay most irregularly, often being forced even to demand it for 3 years. A necessary outcome of such a state of affairs was that the soldier was forced to live by extortions only, and from the property of the citizens whom he should have protected. Meanwhile matters came to such a pass that the average man began to murmur openly, to refuse to fulfil his services, finally to drive out the officers as a whole, and under the command of an elector from his own resources to wage a predatory war, at his own cost, no matter whether against the subjects of the king, of the Republic, or of the German Empire. Neither the personal appearance of the Duke of Alva, nor the severity of the laws, was able to oppose the mutiny. He commanded a few of the dissatisfied corps to be surrounded by loyal troops, and 50 of the rebels to be hung on the spot. But there was soon need of a second army in order to check the dissatisfied army. Indeed, the discipline in the Spanish army, which had become first in Europe because of it, and which had the severest military regulations of all, fell so low that, among other things, Haarlem, when hardly yet conquered, was offered by the triumphant rebels themselves to the Prince of Orange for 40,000 gulden. The city of Antwerp was forced to buy off its sacking with 400,000 gulden, and the troops, being contented with this, returned to their duty for a time, with redoubled zeal. But after the death of Requesens, the consummation of the evil came. Several thousand mutinous soldiers took a lost, and from this centre spread pillage, fire, and murder all over Brabant and Flanders. There was now issued by the Council of State a formal proscription against the Spanish army, and the people were called upon to take up arms and expel the soldiers as perjured traitors. The manifesto, sent out in the name of the king, was undoubtedly the work of the States and of the Orange party. It organised the civil war, which was then waged with the greatest fury imaginable, and it forced even the most peaceable citizen to take up arms for a cause whose last place of refuge up to this time had been Holland and the sea. The whole nation now, for the first time, rose against the Spanish army, and the Union of Ghent was concluded 1576. All the Netherland provinces, except Luxembourg, entered into this alliance, and the Netherlands then seemed to be lost to the Spanish crown. But although the provinces had been united in name at Ghent, yet the factions which continued to exist in them had by no means been reconciled. One is able to distinguish 3 chief parties at this period. First, the Spanish, to which belonged some members of the noblest families, and which was supported by the formidable Spanish army. Then a second, which can be called the Catholics, whose seat was chiefly in Wallonian and Flemish provinces, and which counted as its members the numerous clergy, and the more numerous host of those who held under the guardianship of the clergy. Finally, the Orange party, but which had at its head the only great man that the Netherlands possessed at this period, In the midst of the chaotic complication of interests and events, William of Orange continued to be fully conscious of his purpose, and neither the military success of the Spaniards, nor their cunning policy, nor the distrust of his own countrymen, nor the alluring prospect, and no mishap ever removed him one single step from the path which he had irrevocably chosen for himself. This party, to a certain extent ensured by the geographical position of Holland and Zealand, did not then perhaps know so well as its leader what it really wished, but it certainly did know what it did not wish. It combated less for freedom than for liberties and privileges, more for property itself than for the security of the same. The Hollanders did not wish so much to be their own masters as to protect themselves from the tyranny of their Spanish masters, and thus, without a definite plan, they acted more consistently than all the other factions. In consequence of such disunion, very little can be said of unanimous resolutions, and the proscription declared by the Council of State was by no means sufficient to terrify the most riotous military force. The affair of the insurgents of Alost had now rather become that of the Spanish nation, and all soldiers that up to this time had remained true to their flag joined themselves with them. They elected a leader, erected a gallows for transgressions of discipline, and then, with great reverence, listened to a mass. Thereupon the whole furious band marched against Maastricht, at that time a place of 20,000 inhabitants, and a strong fortress. It was stormed, plundered, and almost literally razed to the ground. The foolhardiness of the revolters went even further. Antwerp, the richest and largest city of the Netherlands, the most important in European trade, a stronghold, which soon afterwards withstood a 13-month siege, was, notwithstanding the defence of the horrified citizens, notwithstanding the Wallonian and German garrison, taken by storm in one afternoon, pillaged, burnt, and given up to the most fiendish atrocities and debaucheries. And still the allied provinces could not unite upon measures to sweep from the country this gang of about 15,000 men. They sought rather to accomplish it by recognition of Don John as the chief stadtholder, and by the treaty of the Perpetual Edict, according to which it was specifically stipulated that all Spanish troops should vacate the soil of the Netherlands. And pleased to state Don John did perform this military political comedy, that is, the troops were sent away, to be recalled in a few months. The governments of the Prince of Orange, Holland and Zealand did not assent to the new treaty, and although the Perpetual Edict after 3 months had outlived its existence, yet it had essentially annulled the Union of Ghent, the latter continuing, however, in its mere form. This happened, furthermore, because the alliance of the Wallonian provinces, Artois, Hainaut, and Douai, for the preservation of the Catholic faith. All this finally brought the negotiations long fostered by the Prince to maturity, and the Union of Utrecht was concluded and announced in January of 1579. Holland, Zeeland, Gelderland, Utrecht, Friesland, Overijssel, and Zutphen were joined in one inseparable union, and mutually coalesced to ward off any attack from without. The cities of Ghent, Antwerp, and Bruges entered into the alliance, and the Prince of Orange, indeed under great limitations, was placed at the head of this new state. Thus the Netherlands were divided into 2 parts, one of which was returned, partly of its own accord, partly by force, under the Spanish yoke, while the other openly renounced its obedience to the king, which, in fact, for the past 13 years it had not rendered him. Therefore, it was no longer the Spaniards who were contending against the common cause of the Netherlands, but Netherlanders of the Wallonian provinces or Flanders, who were making war upon their countrymen in Holland or Zealand, and in truth they soon acted with such bitterness that, for example, they murdered all the Zealanders who happened to fall into their hands while accompanying Prince Maurice to Flanders. But besides the political attitude which all the provinces united at Utrecht had taken in opposition to the rest, there was also the religious difference which formed a chief cause of division among the people of the Netherlands. This difference was bound, of course, to have great influence at a period when religion determined not only the future salvation of the soul, but also the entire present destiny when opinions were judged far more severely than actions by fire and sword, and belief was a matter of both conscience and honour. In consequence of the multifarious modes of communication by which the Netherlands were united to other countries, by sea with England and Denmark, by navigable streams with reformed Germany and Switzerland, they could hardly remain closed to the doctrines of Luther and Calvin. Furthermore, in the sober sound sense of the people, the Reformation found a reception as much more welcome as the immorality and ignorance of the Catholic clergy of the Netherlands and laziness of the monastic orders were hateful and contrary to the taste of the enlightened active citizen. The violent measures which were used against the spreading of the heresy, as soon as its surprising extension had been noticed, amounted to nothing. The heroic courage with which many of the confessors of the new faith died for this teaching proved their godliness before the eyes of the multitude, and Philip himself, who preferred not to rule at all, rather than to rule over heretics, found himself forced to change the public burning of these heretics to a private execution, because 100 new converts sprang from the blood of one martyr to the new faith. The Inquisition was too late to nip the bud of evil against which its force had been directed, and the impossibility of executing its sentences of punishment upon half the nation resulted in its soon becoming as much despised as it had been feared, and in its surviving only a short time its introduction. However, it could not be but that the Reformation enrolled many members among its converts, who brought little honour to it. Excesses like the image-breaking, which in a few days despoiled the magnificent cathedrals of Flanders and Brabant, and which made insolent and criminal mockery of things regarded heretofore with reverence and awe. Such excesses and errors of reformed mass injured the new teaching more than all the fires of the Spanish Inquisition. The crime of the individuals was laid to the religion which they professed nominally, and since the patience which is so essential a part of the Reformation by no means attended it in its first appearance, it is manifest that part of the people, which had remained true to the old faith, became more closely united, and combined against a doctrine from which it had experienced such objectionable usage. The greater part of the provinces of the Netherlands having relapsed under the sovereignty of the Catholic king, the Reformation party needed the protection which William of Orange had granted the persecuted sect quite as much on the grounds of conviction and for the sake of the cause itself, as for political reasons. His clear vision recognized in the Reformation the security for the continuance of the new state established by him. The Spanish armies could tear him from the cities and conquer provinces, but no power on earth, in defiance of better judgment, could again chain the spirit in fetters which it had severed once for all. In Zeeland and Holland the reformed religion was legally recognized, all churches were given up to it, and every other public religious exercise forbidden, without therefore persecuting anyone on account of his opinion. Moreover, a vast number of people of all classes, having been expelled from Brabant and Flanders by the intolerance of the Spanish rule, fled to the United Provinces, whose national wealth they increased by their property, their industry and skill, or under whose flags they fought against their persecutors. If under these circumstances politics and religion were of equally great importance in bringing about a separation in the interests of the north and south of the Netherlands, business affairs in like manner produced a still greater breach in the divided nation. The history of Antwerp is in general that of the commerce of the Netherlands of this period. Perhaps there is no city which can point to such a tragic destiny and to so many horrible catastrophes from the time of its wonderfully rapid florescence until its sudden fall, as Antwerp, which has become so interesting because of a new incident, one joined to those already mentioned. Antwerp's prosperity sprang from the ruins of the worldwide commerce of Bruges. Emperor Frederick III had determined to give this latter city, from the very beginning famous for its revolts and rebellion, a chastisement which would thoroughly cure it of its mania for freedom. He was completely successful in this, and while he kept its harbour, Sluis, closed for 10 years, the entire Levantian and northern commerce had passed over to Antwerp, where the Hanseatic League at the same time opened its office. Antwerp now grew in an unparalleled manner. It soon counted 200,000 inhabitants, The luxury and the products of all parts of the globe poured into its bosom, and what Venice and Genoa had been, what Amsterdam and London were to be, that was Antwerp in the 15th century. The greatest misfortune for the city was the reign of Philip II, the intolerance of this same monarch, the arbitrariness which endangered security and property of the individual, were destined to inflict upon a commercial city where everything depended upon public confidence wounds deeper than even the terrible but transitory catastrophes which happened later. These, in the meantime, were not wanting. The city had begged the government for the Prince of Orange, as the only one who possessed enough authority to keep the three parties of Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists in check, while all, with equal ardour, hated and were ready to attack each other. But when the prince of the office of the stadtholder was called to Brussels, the image-breaking broke out in the city the same evening, and ended in destroying and desecrating one of the most magnificent cathedrals of Christendom. The first time Don Requesens betook himself to Antwerp, but by no means in order to support the defensive provisions of the commander Champigny. He rather let the rebels in, and then offered the city the choice between plunder or payment of a compound tax. The vexed citizens consented to this latter demand, and the stadtholder, who had to pay his troops in such a convenient way, announced to them in the name of the king a general amnesty. A solemn mass celebrated the festivity, and the soldiers, having richly rewarded the churches and monasteries with gifts, marched to the siege of Leyden after a revolt of 47 days. When 2 years later the mutinous soldiers had illustrated in their doings at Maastricht what they had in mind to do with Antwerp, the terrified citizens thought that nothing better could be done than to increase their German garrison by about 40 companies of Wallonian troops. On the esplanade, opposite the citadel, they built fortifications of sacks of wool and corn, on which men and women were at work. When the report had spread abroad that the rebels of Alost had entered the citadel, the city opened fire against the same. Here Sancho de Avila was in command, and under him 5,000 Spaniards were gradually assembled. The desire to have a part in the rich booty of Antwerp had brought them together from all quarters. Such was their eagerness that, despite the long march, no one was willing to enjoy anything until the city was taken. And the same afternoon the furious troop rushed from the citadel to the fortifications. The Wallonians and Germans hardly waited to shoot off their rifles, took to flight, and left the new walls to the enemy, but the inhabitants of the city, which even then had 100,000 residents, and which was so dear to them all, fought and offered a desperate though vain opposition. Half of the city went up in flames, and all cruelties and excesses which in that age were wont to attend the storming of a city were enacted here in their worst form. The booty was immeasurable. The exchange was converted into a gambling house, and in one evening common soldiers gambled away 10,000 florins in Landsknecht, even then a favourite game. Yet in order to keep a part of it, others had their cuirasses and stirrups made of gold. But this robbery was a death-blow to the business of Antwerp. It was a national loss, and the effects were felt throughout Europe. A large number of prominent families, with the ruins of their property, emigrated and fled to Holland, where they did not have to fear such an encounter with troops of their king. When Don John of Austria removed the Spanish army from the Netherlands, Alva had to surrender the citadel of Antwerp to the Duke of Aarschot. Too haughty to do this himself, he delivered the key by his lieutenant, and the Duke swore by the hand of Don Escobedo never to deliver the citadel to anyone except King Philip and his heirs, whereupon Escobedo replied,
God help you so to do. If not, may the devil take you, body and soul.
All present said, Amen, to this. From bitter experience the inhabitants of Antwerp had learned what an ill turn Alva had done them, when he ordered this citadel to be built on the south side of the city, from which source devastation had already twice broken in upon them. Therefore they petitioned, and were allowed by the city council to raise this hateful scourge to its very foundation, a work which all the classes, and even frail young girls, took a part in, the completion of which the citizens celebrated with grand banquets. But they were hardly through with this when the Duke of Parma, who thought that a citadel was very necessary for the city, caused the same one to be re-erected for them. End of section 6.